This month, I read a lot of parenting books and a lot of fiction, not a lot of business books. I'm going to discuss it in today's episode. Welcome to Explore Your Enthusiasm, episode 223 with me, Tara Swiger. Usually we talk about how to build a business that you love and that makes your life awesome. And once a month, I share what I'm reading, my reading list. I ask you guys if you like to hear about this stuff, and you told me that you do. So I'm going to keep sharing it as long as you like it, even though I'm not always reading business books or mindset books or really books that have anything to do with what we do here on the podcast. But I know a lot of you, like me, are giant nerds, and you just like to hear what I'm reading. I love to hear what anybody is reading at any time. So please come share your reading recommendations with me. You can come to the Facebook page. It's just facebook.com/Tara Swiger page, or come follow me on Instagram. I'm at Tara Swiger. I share my books as I read them in my Instagram stories, and you can leave me a message or a comment on any post and recommend some books to me. I absolutely love it. So this month, my books fall in two categories: parenting books and fiction books. So I'm going to start with the parenting books. And let me be clear, I'm not yet a parent. We are in the process of being approved to be foster parents. So everything we can actually do for the process is completed. We're just awaiting on the state to approve us. So the paperwork's been submitted to the state August 8th. And as I record this is August 23rd. So it could happen any time, or it could happen in another 2 or 3 weeks. By the time you listen to this, I might even have a foster care placement. I don't know. So I'm looking for books, not that tell me how to... I was looking for books that tell me what to do with a baby. Like, I'll just be honest, because I woke up in a cold panic a couple weeks ago, realizing that I don't know how much food a baby takes. Like, how often do you feed them? What do you feed them? These seem like basics, but the thing is if you have a baby, and you might not know these things when you have your first baby, but you are with it day in and day out from day one. So you go from like giving it food basically whenever it'll take it. Also, in the hospital, they like tell you, hey, it's time to feed the baby. If you're there for the first, 24 or 48 hours, right? Then you go home and you just feed it when it's hungry. But we'll be getting kids who are all different ages. So I might get somebody who's 3 months old who has a feeding schedule. The other thing is I'm not given that feeding schedule. Like, very, very little information comes from the biological parents when the kids are first placed in your home. Over time, you might meet the biological parents and get to know them, and they'll give you information. But that could take weeks, sometimes months, depending on what the situation is. So I need just like a baseline of where to start, So that's what I was looking for in books. I asked Instagram for recommendations, which is another reason why you should follow me over there, so you can tell me what you think of things. And parenting is one of those topics where everybody has an opinion. The best advice I got is something that's already in line with my own personal philosophy, which is figure out what works best for you and the kids in front of you. Thing is, when you're starting with somebody who's like 3 years old, you just need like a starting place, right? Also, by the way, if you're curious, if you Google feeding schedules of, and then whatever month old, like 24-month-old or 13-month-old, there are really interesting feeding schedules based on like what kind of life you have and if you're breastfeeding or formula feeding. So that gave me a lot of peace of mind to know that, but I thought maybe I could also read a couple books about it. So with that in mind, the book I liked the best so far of what I've read, and I've only read 4 or 5, is The Confident Parent: A Pediatrician's Guide to Caring for Your Little One Without Losing Your Joy, Your Mind, or Yourself by Jane Scott. So Jane Scott was actually born in South Africa to English parents, and she then lived some of her childhood in Africa. She lived some of her childhood in England, and she moved to Australia as a teenager and a young adult. She had her own kids both in Australia and Africa and then America, and so she really pulls from a perspective of parents all over the world do it a different way. This is my favorite book simply because it is pretty like low key, and it also points out that so much of parenting and what we think has to be done is really cultural. Just because we think it has to be done that way doesn't mean other cultures feel like it has to be done that way. And so the question isn't what like other people are telling us to do, but what do they do anywhere in the world that produces calm, happy kids who grew up to be calm, mentally stable adults. Those two things are really different. She doesn't talk about this a lot in the book, but I realized as I was reading these books, they all, even though they have a broad range of kind of perspectives, and they would even say they're on opposite sides of arguments, the thing they all have in common is they're really different from the prevailing parenting model I was raised in. So when I was a kid, and this is the, mid 80s, me and my little brother especially, who's 6 years younger than me, this is also our subculture, our very conservative Christian subculture. The prevailing parenting method was breaking the will of your child. Now, maybe you still subscribe to that, that's fine. What I noticed is most modern books do not talk about breaking the will of your child, which is great because I didn't want to do it anyhow. But it's super interesting to me that nowadays the arguments are on about totally different things. So, Confident Parent, it gives a lot of good advice about sleep, about feeding schedules. It's much more, if you're thinking about the spectrum, and if you're a parent, I've realized now you probably have that about the spectrum, from the attachment, feed whenever it's asked for, let them sleep whenever they want, and in your room. The other end of the spectrum would be feed and sleep on a schedule. Also, when I grew up, the feed on the schedule was super popular. Like everybody, all my little cousins, all my little brothers raised on the schedule. And I was raised around a lot of kids. So that's why I'm like super aware of what parents were doing in the 90s. This is more on the scheduled side, but with a lot of listening to your kids and a lot of talk about what are the signs you want to look for. What I really liked about this book is she points out there's very few things as a parent that are super detrimental to your kids. If you focus on just these things, you can relax about so many of the other ones. So for example, as a pediatrician, the worst thing is like a fall from a great height, right? That causes damage. Also, not having enough neck and head strength, or flat head syndrome, which can come from laying your kid down too much. So things like that's just kind of the perspective that she takes, is there's very few things that matter a lot. And if you're just not letting your kid fall off high things, and you're giving them tummy time, and you're making sure that you both sleep and that they're eating enough, you're going to be okay. So I liked that. That is like my kind of advice. As you know, I'm always telling you, find the thing that works best for you in your business. So this was really like, the name The Confident Parent comes from the idea of like, you need to do and behave in a way that makes you feel confident in what you're doing. And you can have confidence in what you're doing. What's interesting is a book that was on the other end of the spectrum about sleep, and it talks a lot about, of course, not really co-sleeping anymore, but sleeping in the same room as your kid, which is not allowed in foster care. So by the way, a lot of attachment philosophies, or not philosophies, but practices that very, very strict attachment or natural parenting recommends is just not allowed in foster care. Obviously, I can't breastfeed. I couldn't control the birth. And they can't sleep in our room. So the book that's on that side of the spectrum was the Gentle Parenting book, How to Raise Calmer, Happier Children from Birth to 7. That book is much more strict about what they recommend, but it also, like The Confident Parent, talked a lot about confidence, both your own confidence as a parent and the confidence you're instilling in your kids, which I thought was really interesting. So that's the Gentle Parenting book. It was like, okay, I liked the later chapters better. They did do a chapter on gentle parenting with special circumstances, and they gave basically 2 paragraphs to foster care and adoption, which is a shame. I feel like they could have given a lot more. And only another 2 paragraphs to kids with special needs. So while the information in the book was interesting, there were sections where she would answer people's questions, and her question answering was pretty strict. Like, the advice was like, so you're going to figure out what works best for you, and you should, let your child eat when they want to eat. And then someone would write in with a question, and her answer was always pretty militantly follow your child's lead, is what I would say, is where that aired. Whereas a confident parent aired more on the side of you need to figure out what's going to work for you so that you can sleep and you cannot lose your joy, your mind, or yourself. So I thought that was interesting. The last parenting book I want to mention is, I never know how to say this. I think it's Achtung Baby. It's an American Mom on the German Art of Raising a Self-Reliant Child by Sarah Zasky. So this is kind of a memoir of a mom who moves to Germany when she has a 2-year-old. She has another baby while she's in Germany. And basically the German parents kind of blow her mind in how much independence they let the children have from a young age. Anything from walking to the corner, to walking to school once they're in 2nd or 3rd grade on their own, crossing busy streets. This is like in Berlin. And just in some of the ways they think about it. And although, like American parents, they feel scared that something bad will happen, their take is that it's better for the kids to have the independence and to build the confidence and the sense of self from taking little, safer risks. So that book I super, super enjoyed. I am definitely of the more safe risks your kids take, the less sneaky risks they take. I know this from my own teenagehood and from watching my teenage brothers grow up. So it was super interesting. It talks a little bit about, a lot of the things that she talks about are simply structural. So you simply can't do them as an American, like the structural, I know some Brits call it like nursery, like it'd be like preschool here, or daycare is actually in a lot of ways managed by the government and with a very Montessori or Waldorf style, which is super cool, like child-led learning. A lot of schools here don't do that. You don't really have the choice if your kid needs to be in care so that you can work. So a lot of stuff about child-led learning is just not as available outside the home here. So it's interesting to read the structural differences. Also, the whole part about going to the hospital and the healthcare is just like very different in Germany than it is America. So the parts about choices you can make that will help your child be more self-reliant and build their confidence, I thought was really interesting. And it's just like an interesting tale of an American who's living abroad. So that's, I'm not even going to try to say it again. It's by Sarah Zasky. It's all linked up in my show notes. If you go to taraswiger.com/podcast223, you'll find links to everything. So I know this is not a parenting book podcast, but a lot of you guys have kids and a lot of you recommended a lot of parenting books. So hopefully you don't mind hearing about them. So I also read a lot of fiction this month. I was in Oregon for 2 weeks visiting my family, and I did a lot of laying around and reading. I also did camping and reading, and laying in hammocks and reading. So, and being on planes and reading. So some of the books I read are by Alifair Burke. Again, I realize I have read one of her novels every month for like the past 4 or 5 months, but I super enjoy them. It was in her Ellie Hatcher series. It's called All Day and a Night. It was good. Not as great as The Ex and the Wife, which I recommended 2 months ago, but still great. I also read Vicious by V.E. Schwab. This is a kind of sci-fi fantasy book that is like, it's also kind of about superheroes, but how these two people do a science experiment that turns them into superheroes. But what's super interesting is you don't know who's the villain and who's the hero. They both think they're the heroes and the other guy's the villain. So it's really well written, really interesting, really deep, and like, I want to read more of the series. I went to request the next book in the series, but this book, Vicious, just came out in May, so there's no more books in the series yet. V.E. Schwab also wrote another sci-fi series, which I'm spacing on what it's called. I started to read it from the library, but then it was due, so I'm going to get it. I'll talk about it in a future month. She's also publishes young adult novels under the name Victoria Schwab. So you might have read her other books under the name Victoria. Also read 2 books from my Book of the Month Club. You guys, I love Book of the Month Club. I actually will put a link in my show notes. You can go and you can get, I think it's a free book when you sign up. And you don't have to have a book every month, and you don't have to be charged every month. You can like pause it whenever you want. And I tend to get a couple for a couple months and then pause and then go back and get a couple after I read those. What I do is I save them for my trips so that I can bring a hardbound book on my trip and then leave it someplace, because it's, you know, my own book. I can't leave library books. So I read Ghosted by Rosie Walsh, which is actually, I realized later, like a huge hit and been on the New York Times bestseller list. It's about a, it's kind of like a mystery, or like a, it's kind of like a psychological edge of your seat, but nothing bad happens, kind of. Nothing bad happens in the present day, let's say. And basically it's a story of a woman who falls and spends this glorious week with this man. I believe they're in the north of England, and they're gonna, you know, see each other again and talk, and she never hears from him again. And she like starts to fall apart because she can't figure out what went wrong. And then you realize what happened, and it relates to her past and his past, and it's just like, I got to that part of the book, I was like, what? So I left it so my stepmom could read it, because I know she'll love it too. The other Book of the Month Club I read was from May, Mother's Day. It's called The Perfect Mother by Amy Malloy. It's really interesting because it's about this mommy group in, I believe it's Seattle. It's a Pacific Northwest. It might be Portland. I feel like it's either Seattle or it's Berkeley. And they're a mom group that gets together from this online forum. Oh, you know what? It might be Brooklyn. Anyhow, it's one of those places. So this online forum brings together these women who are all due in the same month. So they decide to have a meetup, and of course they support each other as they first start to have their babies. And what's interesting is each chapter is told by a different mom in the group. Kind of. You don't always know, which adds to the mystery. Something happens to one of their kids. The baby has disappeared, and you're not sure what happened. Did the mom hurt it? Did someone else steal it? And these moms in the mom group try to figure out what it could be that happened. They do like some sleuthing, kind of like Miss Marple, except for they're not as good at it. But what's really interesting, what makes it different than just like a kind of mystery thriller, is that you see each of their own perspectives about the other moms, and every single mom says at some point that she's the only one that doesn't have it figured out, and all the other moms have it figured out, and all the other babies are sleeping well, and they're all eating easily. And it's just really great to see like how people are misperceiving how easy it is for somebody else. And then there's also this thriller that's going on, and it has a big twist right at the end. I also read Something in the Water by Catherine Steadman. I'm going to be honest with you, I read this because it was Reese Witherspoon's book club pick. Let's just be honest. I was actually watching the show Younger, which I totally recommend, and they mentioned Reese Witherspoon's book club, and I thought, is this just a made-up thing, or is this real? No, it's real. She has a book club. I think it's just called Reese's Book Club. I Googled it. I found that the first book recommended is Something in the Water by Catherine Steadman. It's another kind of thrillery book. This couple is on their honeymoon somewhere in the Pacific Ocean, some island, Hawaii, Tahiti, something. And they're out on a boat trip, just the two of them in a speedboat. They find this big bag of things that then they decide to keep and not tell anyone that they found. And then trouble ensues because people want back the stuff that they took. They don't know where it came from or why people want it back or who the people are. And they make mistake after mistake after mistake because they're just regular humans and they don't really know how to be criminals. So it's kind of funny, especially if you're married or in a partnership with somebody who handles things differently than you, because they're at the beginning of their marriage, right? This happens on their honeymoon. So it's super interesting, and you're kind of at the edge of your seat, and there's some twists. Also, I read The Death of Mrs. Westaway. I mostly read it because it's by Ruth Ware, and I really liked her book, Woman in Cabin 10. I actually talked about it in December of 2016 on the show. I've linked it up in the show notes, so you can go back if you're interested in hearing about that, which was a woman's on a boat with a bunch of people, like a yacht, and something happens. Kind of murder mystery. And she also wrote The Lying Game, which I went back, I definitely read, but I never talked about it on the podcast. It's a good thriller. I need another word. What's the word for thriller? Mystery? I don't know. Send me a message and let me know. So The Death of Mrs. Westaway, it's basically a mystery that a girl has to unravel. She got a unexpected letter that tells her she inherited a bunch of money because Mrs. Westaway died. Her last name is Westaway, but she thinks these people are no relation to me, but she's like, I'll take the money. So it's set in, she's in Edinburgh, and she goes down to, I want to say Manchester. A big house / castle is where Mrs. Westaway lived, and she has all this money, and the girl thinks, well, I'll inherit a couple £1,000, and they'll never know that I'm not their relation. Well, she's wrong. They're wrong. Everybody's wrong. Super interesting. I need a better word than interesting. So as I was looking these up on Amazon so that I could link them up in the show notes, so you can find links to everything I talked about there, I realized that I use this plugin all the time and I don't think I've ever talked about it. So it's a plugin for your Chrome browser, which I totally recommend using if you don't already, because it just has so many great tools and usefulness. The plugin is called Library Extension. I guess that's what it is, and it's an extension for your Chrome browser. It's at libraryextension.com. I link it up in the show notes. What it does is you put in your library. I think you just put in your zip code, and it will tell you if the book you're looking at on Amazon is available at your library. Isn't that great? So when I'm looking stuff on my phone, it's not on my phone, even though it might work on your phone. I use it just when I'm at my computer and using Chrome. And it's so great. So when I was looking up Ruth Ware books, I realized there's one I hadn't read yet called In a Dark, Dark Wood. I don't think I've read it. And it said there were 8 copies available at my library, 6 of which are available. So I went ahead and requested it right from within Amazon. It's kind of great. So if you also love your library and like to get your books there, totally recommend. If you use Chrome, go to libraryextension.com and use that extension. I super like it. Also, if you haven't clicked over to my show notes of these What I'm Reading episodes, then you are missing out, because at the bottom, not only do I link to all these books, which sure, you could Google on your own, but I also link to what I was reading this time last year and in all the years since I've been talking about my books. So this is what I was reading in September. You can see what I was reading in September of 2017, 16, 15, and 14. I can't believe I've been sharing my reading list with you for that long, but I find it fascinating to click back and see what were the popular books, what was I really into, what obsession was I having. Like lately I've been reading tons of thrillery novels and books by Alistair Burke. And you can go all the way back to 4 years ago and see that I was on a total kick of great classical books. So you can find those in the show notes. There's a little line that says what I was reading in last year, 2016, 2015, 2014, with links back to those posts. So if you are looking for more books to add to your list, I hope you enjoyed this episode. You can find links to everything at taraswiger.com/podcast223. I hope you have a fantastic week with lots of reading.